Welcome back to the deep dive. This time we're heading to the Himalayas, specifically Tibet between 1950 and 1959.
Oh, wow.
A listener wrote in wanting to know more about what went down there and how the idea of rule of law played out. So we're going to be looking at a 1959 report called The Question of Tibet and the Rule of Law.
Okay.
It was put together by the International Commission of Jurists, and they were investigating some really serious stuff. Possible violations of an agreement between Tibet and China, human rights abuses, and there were even whispers of genocide.
Yeah, this report really digs into some sensitive and controversial stuff. It's trying to untangle whether China broke the 17-point agreement, a super important document that shaped the relationship between Tibet and China.
So before we jump into the 17-point agreement, can we just set the stage a bit? I think most people know about the Dalai Lama, but maybe not so much about Tibet itself. What can you tell us about it?
Sure. So picture this massive plateau high in the mountains, with its own distinct culture, language, and a strong Buddhist tradition. Many Tibetans were shepherds, and they lived a pretty isolated life for centuries.
Okay, so we have this unique culture and way of life. Now, before 1950, was Tibet part of China?
Tibet had a long history of autonomy.
Okay.
Actually, after the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1913, Tibet declared independence.
Wow.
There was even this agreement called the Simla Convention involving Tibet, Britain, and China, but China ended up rejecting it. So for decades, Tibet functioned as an independent nation, running its own affairs.
So not officially recognized, but independent in practice.
Yeah.
And then comes 1950 when things changed drastically.
Exactly. 1950 was a turning point. That's when the Chinese People's Liberation Army entered Tibet, leading to the 17-point agreement. This agreement basically made Tibet a part of China, but with the promise of autonomy.
The 17-point agreement, it sounds like a contract with terms and conditions.
Yeah, you could say that.
What did it actually say?
On paper, it seemed like a peaceful integration respecting Tibetan culture. The agreement guaranteed things like Tibetan self-governance in their internal affairs, respect for their religion, and a promise that changes wouldn't be forced upon them. It even acknowledged the Dalai Lama's authority.
Sounds pretty fair. So what went wrong? Where does the rule of law come in? Or should I say, get broken?
Well, the report has a ton of first-hand accounts from Tibetans who claim China violated the agreement's terms, slowly eroding their autonomy. For example, the Chinese established the Preparatory Committee for the Autonomous Region of Tibet in 1955,
Okay.
which Tibetans saw as basically a puppet controlled by the Chinese.
Wait, didn't the agreement specifically say China wouldn't interfere with Tibet's existing political system? That sounds like a clear violation.
That's exactly what Tibetans argued. They saw the Preparatory Committee as China's way of controlling Tibetan affairs while pretending to grant them autonomy.
So was it just different interpretations of the agreement? Did the Chinese have their own perspective on this?
Of course. The report also includes statements from Chinese officials and government documents. Their side of the story is that they respected the agreement, helped Tibet develop economically, and even improve the lives of Tibetans. They point to things like the eradication of smallpox as proof of their positive impact.
So a classic he said, she said situation. But how do we figure out who's closer to the truth? Was there any way to verify these claims?
Unfortunately, one of the biggest challenges back then was the lack of independent observers in Tibet, making it incredibly difficult to know for sure what really happened.
So a lack of transparency from the start, that definitely complicates things. And it just goes to show how important unbiased information and fact-checking are, something that's more relevant today than ever.
Absolutely. It reminds us that we must always be critical of the information we receive, especially when dealing with such complex and sensitive issues.
Okay, so we have Tibet, a region with a long history of autonomy brought under Chinese control with promises of self-governance and respect for their culture. But right from the start, there are accusations of broken promises and conflicting interpretations. This sets the stage for a tense and sadly often tragic situation.
Yes, and the report doesn't shy away from diving into those tragic aspects. It goes into specific areas where Tibetans allege the rule of law was violated, starting with human rights.
Okay, let's talk about that. The report was investigating potential human rights violations, right? What kinds of violations did they allege?
The report draws on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That document outlines fundamental rights and freedoms for all. It systematically presents evidence from Tibetan accounts, alleging violations of a whole range of these rights, from the right to life and freedom from slavery to freedom of religion and expression.
Wow, that's a pretty comprehensive list of violations. Do we have specific examples of what Tibetans experienced?
The report details chilling accounts of killings and massacres in regions like Latang blamed on the Chinese. There's evidence of forced labor used for things like road construction. and many Tibetans claim their property was taken away unjustly under the guise of collectivization.
It sounds like a systematic dismantling of Tibetan society and culture.
And it becomes even more apparent when you look at the suppression of religion, a core element of Tibetan identity. The report includes excerpts from Chinese publications explicitly calling for the uprooting of religion and the dismantling of feudal institutions, which they saw as obstacles to their vision of a socialist society.
That's chilling. It reminds us that ideological clashes can have devastating consequences, especially when one side has the power to enforce its views.
Yeah.
We've talked about broken promises and suppression of culture and religion. Where do we go from here?
Well, the report then raises a question that's even more disturbing, the possibility of genocide.
Genocide. That's an extremely serious accusation. What evidence did they present to support that claim?
The report relies on the 1948 Genocide Convention, which defines genocide as acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. It then meticulously presents the evidence gathered, killings, torture, destruction of monasteries, forced displacement of Tibetans, and the suppression of their culture, language, and religion.
So more than just controlling Tibet, the accusation is that China was trying to erase Tibetan identity altogether.
That's the chilling conclusion the report seems to be building toward. And it's important to remember this was a preliminary report. The International Commission of Jurists intended to launch a full-scale investigation into these allegations.
Wow. It's incredible how a single report can uncover such complexity and raise so many questions. We started with what seemed like a simple question about the rule of law and ended up confronting the possibility of genocide. This is heavy stuff. What were the overall conclusions of this preliminary report?
The International Commission of Jurists determined there was at least a prima facie case of acts potentially constituting genocide. Think of it like this. They found enough evidence to suggest that something terrible might have happened and a full investigation was absolutely necessary. They called for an independent international investigation, a request echoed by the Dalai Lama himself.
Did China respond to these calls for an investigation?
The report doesn't mention a specific response, but considering they considered Tibet an internal matter, it's unlikely they would welcome outside interference.
So a lot of unanswered questions and a sense that justice was not served. It's frustrating, to say the least.
It is. But it also highlights the importance of initiatives like this report. Bringing these issues to light, even decades later, is crucial for understanding what happened and for seeking accountability.
It definitely makes you think about the power dynamics at play, both locally and on the global stage. So we've covered the background of Tibet, the 17-point agreement, the alleged broken promises, and the evidence of human rights violations. What's next on our deep dive agenda?
The report then delves into the legal and political fallout from all of this, specifically focusing on the debate surrounding Tibet's status as a nation. It examines arguments for and against Tibet's sovereignty in light of the events we've discussed.
So from the specifics of what happened to the broader legal implications, I'm ready to dive into those legal complexities whenever you are.
Let's take a moment to process all this information. What stands out to you so far? What questions are swirling in your mind?
It's definitely a lot to process, especially those personal accounts from Tibetans. It's hard to even imagine the suffering they endured. But I'm ready to keep going. Let's untangle those legal complexities in part 2 of this deep dive. Welcome back. We just dove into some heavy stuff, allegations of broken promises and human rights violations in Tibet. Now let's kind of shift gears and explore the legal fallout from all of this. The report goes into some pretty complex arguments about Tibet's status as a nation.
Yeah, that's right. The International Commission of Jurists was trying to figure out how these events impacted Tibet's claim to sovereignty. They were looking at whether Tibet, despite the 17-point agreement, had a legal right to consider itself a separate nation.
So let's talk about the legal arguments. Did the report suggest Tibet had grounds to claim it was still sovereign?
Well, the report explores a few different angles.
Yeah.
One argument hinges on the concept of duress in international law. Essentially, the Dalai Lama argued he was forced to sign the 17-point agreement under threat of violence, basically invalidating the agreement from the start.
So like signing a contract with a gun to your head, it's not really a valid agreement.
It's a powerful argument. But international law is rarely black and white. While duress can be grounds to nullify a treaty, it's not automatic.
I guess that makes sense. You can't just claim duress every time you sign an agreement you later regret. So what was the Commission's take on this argument?
They concluded that there was enough evidence of possible coercion to warrant further investigation. They weren't saying the agreement was definitely invalid, but that it deserved a closer look.
Okay, so more layers of complexity. It's not just about what happened. But whether it meets specific legal criteria, were there any other legal arguments presented in the report?
Yes. They explored another possible legal avenue for Tibet to reclaim its sovereignty.
Intriguing. What was that?
It centers on the idea that China's repeated violations of the 17-point agreement could give Tibet the right to declare the whole thing null and void. It's like a contract. If one side breaks their promise, the other side doesn't have to uphold their end of the bargain.
So China's actions, according to this argument, gave Tibet the legal right to say, we're not bound by this agreement anymore.
Exactly. The report pointed back to all the evidence we talked about earlier. The suppression of religion, forced labor, lack of genuine autonomy. They argued these actions were breaches of the agreement's terms.
It sounds logical. Did the report indicate if this argument held water legally?
They acknowledged that this line of reasoning has been successful in past international legal cases. But there's a catch. Tibet had to formally and publicly declare they were rejecting the agreement.
So they couldn't just assume the agreement was broken. They had to make a formal declaration.
Right. And this is where the Dalai Lama's statement in June 1959 becomes super important. Remember, this is only a few months after the events that prompted this whole report. From his exile in India, the Dalai Lama explicitly rejected the 17-point agreement, specifically citing China's violations.
Yeah, that's a bold move. So from a legal standpoint, did that declaration change Tibet's status?
That's a great question. And it gets to the heart of the debate about Tibet's sovereignty. The Dalai Lama's declaration was a powerful symbolic act, and some argue it solidified Tibet's legal claim to independence. Of course, the reality on the ground was more complicated, but it shows how legal strategies can be used to challenge injustice.
It's fascinating how even in situations like this where power dynamics seem so unbalanced, legal frameworks can play a role.
It highlights the enduring power of legal frameworks and the importance of formal declarations in international relations.
This deep dive is certainly illuminating the intricate workings of international law.
Indeed. It's a reminder that the rule of law, even with its imperfections, can provide a basis for holding those in power accountable and for seeking justice in the face of oppression.
So we've explored Tibet's history, the 17-point agreement, the accusations of wrongdoing, and now the legal complexities of Tibet's status. It's a lot to digest, but incredibly important for understanding the situation. What's next on our journey through this report?
The report also touches upon the international community's response to the situation in Tibet. It specifically mentions India's role, considering their long history with Tibet and the fact that the Dalai Lama sought refuge there. It also alludes to the United Nations' involvement.
Okay, so widening the lens to see how the world reacted. I have to admit, I'm curious, but not exactly optimistic. Did the world stand by while these alleged atrocities took place?
That's a chilling question indeed. Let's take a moment to gather our thoughts. When we come back, we'll explore how the world responded to the crisis in Tibet and consider what, if anything, could have been done to prevent the tragedy that unfolded.
Welcome back. We've uncovered a lot in this deep dive. A region with a rich history facing upheaval, a controversial agreement, accusations of broken promises, and even the specter of genocide. Now let's zoom out and look at how the world reacted to the situation in Tibet.
Right. The report doesn't go into a ton of detail, but it does offer some insights into the international response. Like we mentioned before, India played a key role both geographically and symbolically. They share a border with Tibet, and it was to India that many Tibetans, including the Dalai Lama, fled for safety.
Right. India became a sanctuary.
Yeah.
Did they do anything more than offer refuge? Did they, try to pressure China to change course?
Or initially, India championed Tibet's cause. They appealed to the United Nations, urging them to intervene and protect Tibet. However, over time, their stance softened. This was probably influenced by their own complex relationship with China and a desire to avoid a larger conflict.
Yeah, it seems like realpolitik often trumps moral obligations, unfortunately. What about the United Nations? Did they take any meaningful action?
So Tibet appealed to both the General Assembly and the Security Council, seeking intervention to stop the Chinese advance. However, no significant action was taken.
It's disheartening, but not entirely surprising. The Cold War was at its peak, and the UN was often paralyzed by the competing interests of powerful nations. I imagine Tibet, a remote region with limited strategic value, wasn't exactly high on their list of priorities.
It's a sobering thought. The report doesn't dive into the political maneuvering behind the UN's inaction, but it's clear that Tibet's pleas for help were largely ignored.
So we've spent this whole deep dive uncovering a deeply troubling situation. Broken agreements, human rights violations, and the possibility of genocide. And yet the world seemed to do very little in response. It paints a rather bleak picture.
It does, and it raises some crucial questions that go beyond the specifics of Tibet. It forces us to confront the limitations of international law and the often disappointing realities of global politics.
It's definitely a lot to process. It leaves me with a sense of frustration, even anger at the injustices faced by the Tibetan people. It's hard to reconcile this with the idea of a just and compassionate world.
I understand. It's easy to feel overwhelmed when confronted with such suffering. But remember, knowledge is power. By shedding light on these injustices, by engaging in these difficult conversations, we contribute to a better understanding of the world's complexities.
You're absolutely right. Ignoring these issues won't make them disappear. We need to learn from them, discuss them, and strive to do better.
This deep dive has given you a starting point, a foundation of knowledge. But the journey doesn't end here. I encourage you to continue exploring this complex issue. Delve deeper into the history, the legal arguments, and the ongoing struggle of the Tibetan people.
I absolutely will. Thank you for guiding me through this difficult terrain. It's been eye-opening, to say the least.
Remember, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges, there's always hope. The human spirit is resilient, and the pursuit of justice, though often challenging, is a fight worth fighting.
Beautifully said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep striving for a better world.